Okay, welcome in third part. Here we are going to focus on additional sources of biases. What's the additional source of bias? In order to understand that, we need to take a look at motivation mechanism. In the textbook, you can describe a really extensive description of this mechanism. On one hand, we have rational motives and emotional motives. Also, we have primary motives, secondary motives, dormant motives, more implicit motives, and conscious motives. Those motives play an important role when guiding consumer behavior. In this table, you can find detailed description of those motives. Here, we are going to focus on emotional motives and dormant motives that can explain us why in some cases consumers are so focused on pleasure. They buy for pleasure. To better understand impact of pleasure on consumer behavior, we need to also take into account this distinction between hedonic needs and utilitarian needs. Here we have an example of survival needs that are pure utilitarian needs, and those needs are related to buying basic food or clothes. In the middle, we have specific social needs, like, for example, eating out with your friends or buying nice clothes. On the other side, on the left-hand side, we have all those needs that are focused on needs, hedonic needs, as related to aesthetics. So, for instance, eating chocolate can be seen as a pure consumption that is focused on pleasure. This whole field that studies impact of pleasure on consumer behavior, it's called hedonomics. So it's a simple combination of two words, hedonism and economics. Here I'd like to focus on those aspects that can explain how seek for pleasure can bias decision making. On one hand, we have this impact bias. This impact bias shows that in many cases, the seek for pleasure can heavily disturb our consumer behavior. It happens because we as animals pretty quickly adapt to pleasure. That can be explained by physiological and attentional processes. From a physiological perspective, we adapt to pleasure more easily because pleasure is less important than pain, so we adapt more easily to pleasure than to pain. The same for attention, because if something bad happens in our environment, that can more strongly attract our attention than positive things. Distinction bias is pretty simple, because we as consumers, we tend to select products that are higher in size, in weight, in calories, for instance, if that's important. So we prefer bigger than smaller. Another bias is related to beliefs, because we as consumers, we tend to think that more options are better, because more options, more happiness. That's why we tend to visit stores, malls, where we can select from many different products. We expect that if this kind of decision is made, then that can lead to increase in the happiness. Also, we have projection bias. It's related to the fact that if specific basic needs, like hunger, are not satisfied, consumers, they tend to buy more stuff that do not satisfy this basic need, but they want to mitigate the negative consequences of being hunger. They just want to satisfy this basic need through buying, let's say, clothes. Maybe it sounds silly, but this is how research found that a hungry person can buy more. Also, we have this bias, rule-based choice bias. It basically describes that we are making mistakes when thinking about and planning future pleasure. So if you buy a large house and you expect that in a month or 2 months this house will provide lots of pleasure, because living there you expect would be really pleasant, that never happens. Planned pleasure is never as large as expected. And finally, we have two additional biases. First one is related how we think about our decision-making process. And it was found that consumers who tend to delay their decisions, they also think that it's really rational, but later on it was proved that this indefinite decision delaying can lead to low happiness of consumers. And what is surprising does not mean that those delayed decisions are always the best. And finally, next bias, it's the last bias. It's a bias that describes how people behave when they try to maximize their pleasure, and this bias shows medium maximization. Basically, consumers, they tend to increase pleasure on means that can lead to specific goal achievement. Let's say you can invest money into education, but instead of doing that, consumers, they tend to earn and save all the time. They are not willing to spend the money because they expect that maybe doing that is not a good idea, maybe it would be better to save more and more, and they start to function in a vicious loop. So they never spend, they always save, and nevertheless they are always unhappy as consumers. Okay, that's it. I hope that this brief clip helped you to understand how seek for pleasure can bias our decision making.